You've probably heard one of these phrases and thought it was normal. But what hides behind a simple, do whatever you want? Or the classic, you have to accept me as I am. These words aren't just harmless expressions. They're emotional traps in disguise. And if you don't learn how to spot them, you might end up loving someone who slowly destroys who you are. At first, it sounds like a plea for love, raw, authentic, vulnerable. But what if it's actually a wall? A way to defend the self from discomfort, from change, from reflection? Jung believed true transformation begins the moment we confront the parts of ourselves we'd rather ignore. So what does this phrase really protect? Behind it often lies resistance to growth, the fear that change equals rejection. Accept me as I am becomes a shield for emotional complacency. A refusal to step out of the comfort zone, not because the person can't, but because doing so would mean facing their shadow. And the shadow is never convenient. The shadow, in Jungian psychology, is the unconscious part of us we disown. It's where our flaws, guilt, fears, and unclaimed power reside. So when someone says, "This is just who I am," what they might be saying is, "I'm afraid to see what else I could be," because growth always demands death, the death of an outdated self. This phrase becomes a locked door, a refusal to open the window of self-awareness, because once you open it, you can't unsee the dust. You can't pretend anymore that the problem is always outside. And this is where relationships become battlegrounds. When someone demands acceptance without evolution, they bind love to stagnation. It's no longer a dance, it's a cage. And you, unknowingly, become the jailer and the prisoner. Because trying to love someone who refuses to grow is like watering plastic flowers, hoping they'll bloom. You begin to shrink yourself to keep the peace. You stop challenging them just to avoid another wall. But every time you accept what you know is not healthy, you abandon a piece of your own truth. And that's the cost. Silence becomes your survival tactic. Until one day, your voice disappears completely. The person says, "Accept me," but what they mean is, "Don't ask me to change." And that is not love. That is emotional blackmail, disguised as vulnerability, because real love sees potential, not permanence. It encourages reflection, not excuses. But when someone fears reflection, they attack the mirror. You'll hear them say, "You knew who I was when you met me," as if their wounds were sacred, untouchable, as if healing were betrayal. But love is not about preserving someone's pain. It's about helping them transform it. And if they refuse, the pain begins to spread. This phrase can also hide entitlement, the belief that love must come with no demands, no boundaries, no growth, no effort. But anything that doesn't evolve rots. Even the purest love turns bitter when imprisoned in repetition. And this is where you must ask yourself, what are you really accepting? You are not here to be a witness to someone's self-destruction. You are not here to carry someone's refusal to grow. Acceptance without accountability is self-betrayal, because in the name of love, many women abandon themselves daily, but you don't have to be one of them. The most dangerous comfort is the one that whispers, "This is just how I am," because it invites you to sleep beside a person who has stopped dreaming, and slowly their stillness infects your movement, until you forget that love was meant to be a current, not a dam. But this is just the first sign. It sounds like a red flag wrapped in a sob story. All my exes were toxic. 5 words that create instant sympathy and silence your questions. But Jung warned us, what we deny in ourselves, we project onto others. And this phrase often hides a refusal to look in the mirror, because if everyone else was the villain, what role did they play? It begins with generalization, turning complex pasts into one recycled script. But life doesn't work that way, and neither do relationships. If every partner ends in chaos, maybe the pattern is the partner. Or maybe the chaos is a mirror, reflecting something deeper, a wound, a defense, a shadow longing to stay unseen. Jung called this unconscious projection, when we take what we hate in ourselves and toss it onto others like emotional camouflage. It protects the ego, but poisons the truth. Because if all exes were monsters, the person becomes the innocent prey. And victims don't change, they survive, but they don't transform. This is where healing stagnates. Because when you believe you've only ever been hurt, you miss the chance to ask, why did I stay? What did I ignore? What did I choose? And why? Self-inquiry becomes buried under blame, and blame is a powerful drug. It feeds the story of being the good one. It paints the past in black and white, so you never have to see the gray. But in doing so, it erases growth, because if you were never part of the problem, there's no reason to change. People who say, all my exes were toxic, often wear that pain like armor. But it's rusted, heavy, and full of holes. And eventually, it cuts the new relationship too. Because no one wants to pay for someone else's history, especially if that history is being rewritten as prophecy. You'll feel it in their suspicion, in how quickly they accuse, how slowly they trust. You'll notice that even your kindness gets interrogated because the past is still alive and it's sitting at your dinner table, uninvited but ever present. They'll test your love like it's a crime scene. They'll measure you against ghosts. And the more you try to prove you're not like the others, the more you disappear, because proving your innocence is not the same as being loved. Sometimes this phrase also conceals narcissistic wounds, a need to always be right, adored, unblemished. If everyone else was wrong, they stay clean, above reflection. But love without humility turns toxic too. Even if it hides behind tears, this narrative creates a pattern of repetitive victimhood, a person who's always running but never really healing. And if you get pulled into that loop, your relationship will orbit pain, not joy, not curiosity, not truth, just old scars pretending to be destiny. What they won't say is, maybe I was toxic too, because that takes courage. To admit you've hurt, misjudged, repeated what hurt you. But that's the doorway to healing, and most would rather stay outside, where the story is simpler and ego stays safe. But here's the secret. Projection never stays quiet. It leaks, it accuses, it manipulates, and if you're not careful, you'll start believing the script wasn't written by pain, that maybe you are like their exes. And that is how love gets reprogrammed into punishment. So, when you hear, all my exes were toxic, listen carefully, not to the words, but to the wound beneath them. Because if they haven't healed from their past, they might try to turn you into it, and this is just the second sign. Love is not a transaction, but this phrase turns it into one. If you really loved me becomes a loaded weapon. It disguises emotional coercion as romantic truth, and suddenly, love has a price tag. This is not affection, it's negotiation, one that thrives on guilt instead of connection. You are no longer loved freely. You're being measured. Each act becomes a test, each no a betrayal. And what's left is not love, but silent control. Jung warned of the danger in conditional relationships, where the self is bent, trimmed, reshaped to fit another's script, because when love demands obedience, individuation dies. You stop. Being you, you become a performance. And that is the birth of resentment. If you loved me, you'd do it, is never about love. It's about power, about emotional dominance. It preys on your desire to be good, to be enough. So you comply, not from joy, but from fear. And that is how love becomes labor. This phrase often comes wrapped in vulnerability, tears, pleas, silence, all carefully timed. But underneath, it's a chess move, a way to bend the board without moving a piece. You lose, but you're told it was your choice. Over time, it chips away at your inner compass. You stop trusting your no. You begin to feel guilty for setting boundaries, and eventually you forget what you want, because your love became a leash. Jung spoke of the importance of wholeness in relationships, where each person stands complete, not dependent. But this phrase fractures that balance. It says, "My need is truth, your limit is betrayal." And in that dynamic, someone always disappears. You start walking on eggshells. Every request becomes a moral dilemma. Do you protect your own boundaries or prove your love again? The pressure becomes constant, and love turns to tension. This is the logic of emotional blackmail. It doesn't scream, it whispers. It doesn't argue, it insinuates. And if you push back, you're told you don't care enough, even if what's being asked erodes your soul. Sometimes the ask is small, but it's never really about the thing itself. It's about obedience, about bending. And once you bend, the next ask is easier to make, until one day you don't remember the last time you said no. This dynamic often roots in childhood wounds, where love was earned, not given, where pleasing meant safety. And now the adult relationship repeats the same script. Love becomes proof, not presence. What they want is not your love. It's your surrender. But surrender is not the same as devotion. One empties you, the other frees you. And if someone cannot feel loved unless you obey, they are not asking for love. They are asking for control. You'll know this pattern by how exhausted you feel. Like you're always failing a test you never signed up for. Like your worth is always on trial. But love isn't a courtroom, and you don't have to keep proving your innocence. So when someone says, "If you really loved me," pause. Listen. Deeper. Because real love doesn't manipulate, it liberates. And if you're being coerced in the name of love, that's the third sign. Few sentences cut as deep. "You're not enough for me" doesn't just critique the relationship, it wounds the soul. It plants doubt like a virus. Maybe you were never truly lovable. But in Jungian terms, this isn't really about you. It's about the speaker's own unfulfilled self. When someone says this, they reveal an internal hunger, not for you, but for what they believe they lack inside. You become a placeholder, a mirror, a failed cure. And when the emptiness returns, they blame the reflection, not the wound that's still bleeding inside them. This is the voice of projected insecurity. A soul convinced that wholeness comes from the outside. They chase love like a drug, euphoric, fleeting, unstable. And once the high fades, they turn cold. Because nothing outside can ever complete what's broken within, Jung taught. That the true path to wholeness is inward. But people afraid of that path will project their void onto others. They say, "You're not enough," when what they mean is, "I don't know how to be enough for myself." But blaming you is easier than confronting that truth. This phrase is also a form of emotional sabotage. It pushes you away while pulling you closer, because they want you to fight for your worth, to beg, to prove, to break your own back for their love. And that's how you lose yourself. You start to chase their approval like oxygen. You bend, twist, overperform. But no matter how much you give, it's never enough. Because they weren't looking to be loved. They were looking to feel superior. "You're not enough for me" is not just rejection. It's power play. It's designed to shrink you while inflating them. They rise by cutting you down. Because if you believe you're small, they feel big. But this is not confidence. It's compensation. This behavior often comes from unresolved shame, a belief that if they can't feel worthy, neither should you. So they transfer their self-disgust into judgment, and you, unknowingly, carry a wound that was never yours. You start doubting your light because they fear their shadow. The damage is subtle but persistent. You begin to second-guess your every move. You measure your worth by their mood, and you stop recognizing the person you used to be. That's how this phrase steals your identity. Sometimes this shows up in comparison. They'll mention others, more beautiful, more successful, more whatever. Not to inspire you, but to make you feel lacking. It's psychological warfare disguised as honesty, and it keeps you perpetually chasing their impossible standard. This dynamic is rooted in emotional dependency. They expect you to fill the void they refuse to face, and when you can't, you're blamed for their own collapse. But no one can be someone else's salvation, especially when they reject saving themselves. You're not enough often means, I don't feel like enough, and I'm projecting that pain. But the irony is, they won't say it that way. They'll mask it with arrogance, detachment, even cruelty, because vulnerability would expose the truth. And the truth terrifies them. The moment you start believing their words, you begin to shrink into someone you're not. And the tragedy is, the smaller you become, the more they believe they were right. That's the poison of this phrase. But here's what you must remember. Their emptiness is not your failure. Their dissatisfaction is not your reflection. You are not responsible for someone else's unlived life, and this is only the fourth sign. It sounds like freedom, like generosity, but in reality, it often reeks of punishment. Do whatever you want isn't an invitation. It's a trap, a phrase soaked in passive-aggressiveness, resentment, and hidden disapproval. And if you fall for it, you step into a game with no rules. This isn't emotional maturity, it's emotional ambiguity. They don't express what they feel, they punish you for not knowing it. And suddenly, you're tiptoeing around invisible landmines, because behind their silence is a scream they refuse to voice, and you're left to guess the melody behind their quiet. Jung warned about the dangers of emotional avoidance. When people repress instead of confront, distort instead of communicate. This phrase is a textbook example. It looks harmless, but it erodes trust from within, because communication should clarify, not confuse. When someone says, "Do whatever you want," they rarely mean it. What they mean is, "I'm angry, but I won't say why. I'm hurt, but I expect you to fix it without asking." This is emotional manipulation through vagueness, and it creates an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear. You start to question your own reality. Did I do something wrong? Should I apologize even if I don't know why? That's how emotional fog sets in. And in fog, people lose direction and themselves. This phrase punishes honesty, because even when you ask, "What's wrong?" they'll say nothing. But their energy says everything, and the silence becomes louder than any scream. This isn't just poor communication, it's dysfunctional power play. They withhold to control. They silence themselves so you feel the tension. It's not resolution they seek, it's superiority. They want you to feel guilty without ever taking blame, and guilt is a powerful leash. You start managing their emotions instead of your own. You read their expressions like weather forecasts, and love becomes a game of emotional charades, where no one wins, but you always lose. This behavior is rooted in repressed resentment. Things they never voiced are now weaponized in silence. Instead of healing, they let it rot. And you're expected to guess which wound you touched, even if you had no idea it was bleeding. Sometimes this phrase is also about testing. They want to see if you'll choose them, without being asked. But love shouldn't be proven through psychic games. It should be felt through clarity, not confusion. And testing love only proves insecurity. Do whatever you want is a setup. If you act freely, they'll accuse you of not caring. If you hesitate, they'll call you weak. There is no right move, only more traps. And you are the pawn, not the partner. You begin to overcompensate, to make up for things you didn't do wrong, to chase forgiveness for crimes never named. And slowly, your peace becomes hostage to their moods. That is not love, it's emotional imprisonment. Healthy love speaks. It doesn't sulk. It clarifies. It reaches. It admits when it's hurt. But when silence becomes a weapon, connection dies. And what's left is tension wrapped in politeness, a quiet war that no one wants to name. So when you hear, do whatever you want, don't obey, interpret. Ask yourself, is this freedom or fear? Is this love or control? Because silence too can scream, and this is the fifth and final sign. If you've heard even one of these phrases, don't ignore that feeling in your gut. Your intuition isn't paranoid, it's wise. And it knows when love has stopped being safe and started becoming a slow erosion of your soul. You don't owe anyone the sacrifice of your self-worth. You don't need to prove your love by abandoning your truth. Real love doesn't need manipulation, guilt, or silence to survive. It grows in clarity, in courage, in honest reflection, and anything less than that is not love. It's a performance, so ask yourself, which of these phrases have I accepted too many times? What part of me still believes this is normal? And what would happen if, just once, you chose yourself first? You are not too sensitive. You are not asking for too much. You are asking for truth. And that is rare. So, protect it. Speak it. Even if your voice shakes. Especially then. If this made you think or feel seen, leave a comment and tell me what resonated with you most. And if you're ready to go deeper, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notifications, and stay with us. This is just the beginning.